because the issue of every prisoner's accommodation was starting to be put in order. The authorities were trying to put the commandos together. I got moved from Block 12 to Block 25, which I have already mentioned, together with a group of other prisoners who had been working in the Lederfabrik, or, as it was still officially called, Bekleidungswerkstätte. The beds, which were being successively delivered to all blocks, were wooden, one on top of another, making up triple-decker bunk beds. They were yet to reach Block 25. We were sleeping side by side on a bare floor. About 240 people in the room, horribly squashed, which in the lager jargon was called na zakładkę, on one side only. At night, just like a year earlier, people were walking on others, trampling their heads, stomachs, aching legs, when going to the lavatory and not finding any space to lay down again upon their return. This is not a particularly pleasant memory, but since I am writing down everything, I will mention this as well. Due to some inefficiency in the camp's economy in winter 1941, starting from December, Swedes were being brought into the camps in trains and moved to mounds from the side tracks located 3 kilometers from the camp. Because the farm commandos and other Zugangs that were being finished off in the field were not physically fit enough for this work, strong men were taken from workshops. Sundays were dedicated for this activity. I usually tried to avoid that, pretending, thanks to Dr. II, Władysław Dering, to be summoned to the infirmary for a simulated radiography or checkup. One Sunday, however, was rather sunny, a lovely day indeed. I went with everyone else. I was carrying baskets of Swedes along with Zygmunt Kostecki. Capos and SS men were making sure that the baskets were full, and we were keeping them full indeed. At one point, as we were loading the rest of the Swedes, we only loaded our baskets half full, but it was already high time to return to the barracks. The 100 men were beginning to form rows, so the Unterkampo, who was filling up baskets, decided that it was too late to fill them completely. He told us to go with whatever was in our baskets. An SS man was standing in the square that we had to cross. He saw from a distance that our baskets were not full enough. He ran at us and smacked my hands with a rod. We stopped. He pounced on me, for some reason yelling, "Du polnische Offizier," smashing my head and face with his rod. It must be some kind of nervous reflex, but in such situations I have experienced several of them. I sport a grimace, a grin of a kind which fueled the SS man's rage even more. He hit my head again with even greater strength. It lasted, I presume, only a short while, but many thoughts race through a man's mind at a moment like this. I recalled a saying, X and Y, you can't beat him down, even with a rod. A saying that has been around since one or another uprising, and now I really did smile. I must have been stunned, as I did not really feel much pain. The SS man looked at me and growled, "Du lächelnde Teufel." I did not know what would have happened if it was not for the sound of the camp siren, which distracted him. Someone had escaped. My colleagues told me later on that I was lucky. My head and my face were swollen for 2 weeks after that, though. The second time I got beat up was much later, in the tannery. My colleagues were smoking cigarettes in the lavatory, while smoking during work time was prohibited. Suddenly, Capo Walter burst in like a tiger, identity unknown. I did not smoke. but I was just leaving. He jumped at me. "Who's been smoking?" I remained silent, but must have smiled unwittingly. "Was? Gefällt es dir nicht?" I do not know the grounds which led him to the conclusion that I liked something or not. Walter, identity unknown, was a fiend, able to knock a man down with a single strike. I got hit many times on the head, and I landed on the ground several times. Every time, according to what 59 Henryk Bartosiewicz and 61 Konstanty Piekarski told me later. I kept standing up with a grimace akin to a grin. Walter, identity unknown, left me eventually because the camp's commandant arrived, and Erik Grünke was nowhere to be found at that time. In the meantime, beyond this hell far away in Warsaw, I was promoted for assembling the TAP, for working towards the integration in KZN, for disregarding my own ambitions, and with General Sikorski's authorization, for pursuing the aim of submitting all the troops to ZWZ, with some of the first bone of contention with 82 Jan Włodarkiewicz. Who knows, maybe this was the reason why I had left Warsaw. And yet, Janek W., Jan Włodarkiewicz, filled the motion, and according to Bohdan, 85, Zygmunt Bohdanowski watched over my case, saying that he cared more about my promotion than for his own. Colonel Grot, Spearhead, Stefan Rowecki promoted several of us from KZN. 82, Jan Włodarkiewicz, and 85, Zygmunt Bohdanowski, reached the rank of lieutenant colonel. This way, finally, under my very own name, I was promoted to lieutenant. So in fact, I got back to 1935. If back there in hell, I would not have considered such matters insignificant. I would rather consider them bitter. Good positions in Auschwitz included, among others, nurses who treated pigs, so-called Tierpflegers, musicians who were usually not only members of the orchestra, but room foremen as well, and barbers. Usually, they tried to combine these two functions, being a barber and a room foreman, but even if that was not the case, barbers were doing all right anyway. There were barbers who shaved only the SS men, but also each block had several barbers whose only duty was to shave the entire block every week. Hair cutting and shaving was mandatory for prisoners, but it was done by the barbers. The blockmen and the room foremen were held responsible for any prisoner from their block who had not been shaved properly or whose hair was even slightly too long. A barber received more than enough food from the blockmen, the capos, and the room foremen. One December evening, 1941, we were standing next to Block 21, new numbering, with Colonel 1, Władysław Surmacki, and Doctor 2, Władysław Dering, and talking, when we were struck with the sight of a group of naked people, steaming heavily, who were leaving Block 26, new numbering. They were Poles, 100 give or take, sent here to be finished off as quickly as possible. Having put them under hot showers for a longer while, about half an hour, unsuspecting anything, they took the showers gladly, whereupon the German authorities later put them out in the open, exposing them to snow and cold. We had to go back into the block already, and they were still standing there, freezing, emitting muffled groans or animal-like howls. They kept them like this for several hours. When a larger group of prisoners was finished off one way or another, or gunned down at once, the infirmary was given a list with their numbers and had to, reporting the list of those who had died that day to the camp office, adds 50 a day from this list as allegedly deceased due to heart failure, tuberculosis, typhoid, or some other natural illness. 1941 was coming to an end. The second Christmas in Auschwitz came, and with it, the second parcel from home, again containing clothes, as it was still not allowed to send food. In Block 25, where the blockman 80, Alfred Włodarczyk, turned out to be supportive of our work. In Room 7, where 59, Henryk Bartosiewicz, was the commandant, we had a Christmas tree with the Polish eagle hidden in its branches. The room was tastefully decorated by 44, Wincenty Gawron, and 45, Stanisław Gutkiewicz, with my modest contribution. On Christmas Eve, the representatives of our political division made several speeches. Would it be ever possible on earth to see Dubois listening contentedly to Rybarski's speech and cordially shaking the latter's hand afterwards, or the other way around? In the past, in Poland, such a scene of concord would be as tear-jerking as it would be impossible. And here, in our room in Auschwitz, they spoke with one voice. What a metamorphosis! One Volksdeutsch, a Silesian who was nevertheless working with us as 81, Alois Paul, informed me about a new initiative of the camp's political department, which posed a serious threat to me personally. There were not many of us, the old lags, left around at that time. It was particularly visible on the occasion of payouts. Money sent to us by our families was paid out monthly, 30 marks once, or 15 marks twice a month. If a larger amount was sent, it remained in the inmate's account. Later on, the payout limit was raised to 40 marks a month. We could spend the money in the camp canteen to purchase everything that was detrimental to one's body: cigarettes, saccharine, mustard, sometimes salad and vinegar, pickles. In order to get paid, we all had to stand sorted according to our camp prisoner numbers. A couple of times, they even forced those who had no money at all to show up, just to sign their accounts. It was then when I was easiest to count everyone, starting from the first to the last numbers, and realize how many of each 100 was still alive. The havoc of the hundreds was enormous, especially in the Warsaw transports. Maybe it was so because the very first transports, which had been already here when we arrived, got jobs under the roof, while we were being finished off out in the open. Or maybe because people in Warsaw, as the Silesians were saying, had no endurance. Or maybe because other groups had gained more favor in the eyes of the camp's authorities. Suffice it to say, some hundreds of people from the Warsaw transports were now reduced to 2 people. There were 6 people left in our 100. There were also relatively large hundreds, which counted 8 people still alive. But there were also those which were not represented by anyone anymore. The political department came up with an idea of checking the metric data of everyone who is still alive at this point, starting from the first numbers, which, considering how few of us were left, was no hardship. Maybe someone was using a false identity, like me. In order to hunt down such dodgers, the political department would send written requests to parishes asking for excerpts from their registers regarding each prisoner. These letters were addressed to the parishes where the prisoners under investigation were born, or at least testified so when interrogated. If one wants to imagine my situation, They need to get back to the year 1940, to Warsaw. Warsaw society was eager to help those committed to underground resistance work, especially in the first period of the movement, when the concentration camps and Szucha Avenue were not so horrifyingly advertised yet. Later on, finding an apartment was more difficult, but at the beginning, kind Polish families gladly lent us their premises to use for underground purposes, along with their own personal support. In this initial period, I had several flats and several personal IDs with various names registered in different places. Back then, however, it was still possible to leave one's personal ID in the apartment when going out. Because of that, I did not carry my ID cards with me. When apprehended on a street, I would give one of my names and the apartment that would be least incriminating at the given moment, and which would have an ID card left in it. One of the apartments I had been using for work belonged to Madame 83, Helena Pawłowska. She told me one day that she had an ID card made for a real name belonging to one of our officers, 84, Tomasz Serafiński, who had already been moved to another area before his ID card was ready. Since the ID card came with a labor card, I accepted 83's proposal to use it as my own after changing the photo in it. I had this ID card on me when I went to the street roundup, having assumed, and correctly so, that the name had not been blown yet, and so I had the ID card of a real person, 84, Tomasz Serafiński, who was living somewhere out there. But the ID card did not say anything about the mother's maiden name. When we were examined at night in Auschwitz soon after our arrival, I made one up, as I had to give some name. Because of that, however, the situation was rather quite unknown. When my turn came, and I was bound to come in a few months, and the political department requested the parish in the town, Gdzie, to send them an excerpt from the registers, or rather Mr. 84's, Tomasz Serafiński's, vital records, the name and mother's maiden name would not match those I had given. They would summon me, ask about my identity, and that would be it. But happy coincidence. My fellow prisoners captured during the same street roundup, several hundreds of them, as I have already mentioned, were quarantined at that time, scheduled to be released to Warsaw shortly. Colleague 14, Antoni Woźniak, passed on a message to my sister-in-law, Mrs. E.O. Eleonora Ostrowska, informing her about the surname and mother's maiden name that I had given the camp's authorities. A good number of our colleagues were departing, some of them members of our organization. Besides, 14, Antoni Woźniak, 9, Czesław Wąsowski, was also going. Colonel 1, Władysław Surmacki, went to the Freedom Bloc, having been released thanks to the efforts of his old friend from his student days in Berlin, now a senior officer in the German military. Colonel 1, Władysław Surmacki, was to pass on my report on the organization's work in Warsaw. I sent a number of messages through colleagues, 86, Aleksander Paliński, as well. He had been imprisoned only because his last name matched that one of our colonels. To complete the image of the camp at that time, I mean only the things that I had witnessed myself, as I can't describe everything I heard from colleagues working in other commandos. I also need to mention the so-called Ziedler Week. During 1 week in December 1941, we saw a display of cruelty by Ziedler, an extraordinary sadist, substituting for the Lagerführer. It was a week of especially dreadful weather. The cold, damp wind and rain mixed with frozen snow was penetrating not only our clothes, but our bodies as well. freezing us to the marrow. In the evening, it was even colder. Ziedler had resolved to use even that as a mean of exterminating as many prisoners as possible. Every day, starting from 5:45 p.m., signaled by a gong calling for the evening roll call, we stood in wet clothing, fighting the biting cold till 9 p.m., only released from the standstill in the roll call square before the very gong urging us to sleep. We had to quickly swallow cold supper given to us in the evening and rush to make it in 15 minutes with everything that had to be done before going to sleep. These standstills lasted a week, because allegedly every day someone was missing from the roll call, which was, naturally, made up by Ziedler. This ended when his time as a substitute in receiving evening reports from Palicz came to an end. Still, that 1 week made us pay a hefty price in our strength. Many of the weaker inmates paid the price of their lives. The camp office never notified the families of the deceased prisoners about their deaths unless explicitly told to do so by the political department. Information about a prisoner's deaths breaking out into the world outside the camp was not always convenient for the German authorities, mainly because it interfered with other investigations where other prisoners kept in one or another jail were being threatened. We already have a prisoner X, and he is telling the whole truth. 1941 was coming to an end. 1942 was about to begin. It was to be the most horrifying year in Auschwitz, but as far as the work of our organization was concerned, it was the most interesting one, as we had our greatest achievements in that year. And it just so happens that, because of a lack of time before making a new decision, I must write very laconically. Out of the blue, a rapid and substantial change of attitude towards the Jews occurred. Much of everyone's wonder, the remaining Jews were taken from the SK and put together with the Jews who were only just brought to the camp at that moment, Zugangs. They were all assigned to work indoors, in good conditions, making stockings or peeling potatoes or preparing vegetables. They even assumed a haughty attitude toward us. However, they did not expect that some monstrous, deceitful intent lay behind all this. It was all about the letters, in which, for these several months, the Jews were writing that they were made to work in the workshops, and they were treated well. The fact that these workshops were located in Auschwitz, an unknown name of some town, mattered nothing to Jews in France, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, Greece, where these letters were being sent. Even Poles in Poland knew very little about Auschwitz at that time, and their approach to someone's imprisonment there was rather naive. Our Polish Jews were usually finished off in Treblinka or Majdanek. Jews from all over Europe were brought to Auschwitz. The Jews, after a couple of months of writing letters praising their conditions, were suddenly taken off various jobs and quickly killed. In the meantime, transports carrying tens of thousands of Jews from all over Europe were sent to Birkenau, where the construction of the first buildings of the new camp had already come to an end. The approach to the clergy had long since changed, but for another reason. Due to some influence that the Vatican must have had on the Reich's government via Germany's ally, Italy, the priests were moved to Dachau for the first time at the beginning of 1941, for the second time in July 1942. I heard that Dachau, in comparison to Auschwitz, was actually a acceptable environment for priests in terms of survival. In the period between these two transports, I met several brave priests in Auschwitz, Father 87, Zygmunt Ruszczak, among them. He was the chaplain of our organization. We had masses and confessions celebrated in secrecy, shielded from praying eyes. The hosts were delivered to us by the clergy thanks to our contacts with the civilians outside the camp. The beginning of 1942 was marked by the swift extermination of the rest of the Bolshevik POWs. They were murdered quickly and efficiently as their blocks had to be reassigned. A new massacre was about to start. The corpses of Bolsheviks who were killed at the road construction sites, digging trenches near Birkenau, were brought in wagons, several wagons to each roll call. Some POWs simply froze to death, unable to muster even enough strength to start working, which could have warmed them up a little bit. One day, during work, the Bolsheviks mutinied and attacked the SS men and the capos. The riot was brutally pacified. The entire division was gunned down. The corpses had to be brought to the roll call in the pushcarts in several runs for the camp authorities to count them properly. Having killed every single one of them, February 1942, excluding the several hundred that I have already mentioned, the camp authorities quickly dismantled the fence erected between our camp and the POW's camp. At the same time, another fence was built in another place, serving another purpose. 10 blocks were separated from us by a high concrete wall. Women were about to be kept there. That was a novelty in the camp. In the first stages of its existence, the camp used to work on Sundays as well. Later on, Sundays were allegedly free, except for the first half of the day, till lunch. It was forbidden to leave the blocks, Blocksperre. Now, in order to minimize our possibilities to communicate with each other and organize ourselves, 2 more hours on Sundays were taken away. After lunch, from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., everyone had to undress and go to sleep. The block foreman would check the rooms. The camp senior and the Lager Capo were in charge of checking the blocks, because a prisoner who was not sleeping was squandering his health, an outrageous irony. So, needed by the Third Reich, so he suddenly was a saboteur. On January 18th, 1942, due to the lack of space in overcrowded bunkers, 45 prisoners were locked from the night in the dark-room bunker. Moments later, still in the evening, in the underground part of Block 11, new numbering, someone started to bang on the door and call to the SS man standing guard to open it. These prisoners were suffocating, fighting with their teeth, fists, and knives for access to the door. Some air was getting into the room through a small gap in it. After that night, out of 45 prisoners initially locked in, 21 were dead by the morning. They either suffocated or died in the fight. Out of the remaining 24, 9 inmates, also at death's door, were taken to the infirmary, and 15 were sent to the SK in punishment for not dying in the darkness. Konrad Lang, the former Oberkapo of the carpentry workshop, was among them. Capo Johnny Johann Leichenich, locked at the time in the standing cell as a punishment for some machinations with the Poles, as the authorities called it, bore witness to this horrifying night. In February 1942, a letter came to the political department from the party authorities in Berlin, banning the policy of joint responsibility and killing 10 prisoners for each fugitive. Apparently, this was the result of a similar policy being enforced in some camps for Germans. Simultaneously, An official order banning beating the prisoners was released as well. I wonder, was this because of our reports? Since then, there were no major repressions against the prisoners in relation for other prisoners absconding. The option to flee became viable again, and so we, as an organization, started to prepare a report with the intention of sending it to Warsaw by means of organized escape. The Bolsheviks had left behind lice and a horrible Siberian type of typhoid, which started to infect whole groups of our colleagues. Typhoid gained purchase in the camp, spreading desolation everywhere. The camp's authorities were very glad and watched with satisfaction the work of that new ally of theirs in the vile job of murdering prisoners. In response, we started to breed lice infected with typhoid in the infirmary's laboratory. We would put them on the coats of SS men every time they demanded a report or inspected our blocks. A mailbox was hung outside of Block 15, and it was announced in all the blocks that denunciations, signed or not, were expected to be put in there, reporting all overheard conversations in the blocks. A prisoner who delivered a report that would prove useful to the camp's authorities was to be rewarded. They wanted to protect themselves against our organization's activity. A stream of anonymous letters and reports started to flow. Captain 88, Tadeusz Gdzie, opened the box every evening, and he browsed through the letters before Pilecki could get to them at 10 p.m. Dangerous messages that threatened our work were destroyed, and in their place we put reports aimed at harmful individuals. This is how the paper fight had begun. Both while in the blocks and while marching to work, they made us sing German songs. A couple of times the entire camp had to sing during the roll call. In Birkenau, the gas chambers were being built in great haste. Some of them were already standing. What I was afraid of inviting officers imprisoned under their own names into the organization was not without grounds. Should a suspicion arise among the camp's authorities about the possibility of any covert activity taking place among the prisoners, the officers would surely be the first to go to the bunker. One day, they locked Colonel 62, Jan Karcz, in the jail bunker, taking him every day to the political department for interrogations. Every time he came back from there, he was pale, barely able to stand straight. I was afraid of various complications. After over 2 weeks, Colonel 62, Jan Karcz, approached me with colleague 59, Henryk Bartosiewicz, and said, "Well, you can congratulate me now. They let me go. They wanted to know if there was any underground movement in the camp." Saying goodbye as it was time to go to sleep, he said, "Worry not. I told them nothing. I'll tell you everything tomorrow." But in the morning, he was moved to Rajsko, perhaps precisely to prevent him from saying anything. Colonel 62, Jan Karcz, was audacious indeed. Over 100 Czechs were brought to the camp, all well-educated people, the Sokół Falcon organization. They located them in our room, Block 25, Room 7, and started to exterminate them in no time. I made contact with a representative of theirs, 89, Karol Stransky. He is alive and lives in Prague. In agreement with Colonel 64, Kazimierz Heilmann, I showed my trusted friend, Lieutenant 29, around all the units of our organization in the camp. I did it just in case of some tragedy happened to me. Lieutenant 29, Włodzimierz Makaliński, reported to Colonel 64 that we had seen 42 units. One day, they moved from our Stammlager Auschwitz to Birkenau, a group of 70 to 80 Silesians, rumor had it, to have them killed, including my friend, 45, Stanisław Gutkiewicz. He had anticipated this the evening before that fateful day. He was anxious and was shivering at night. He asked me to pass on a message about himself to his wife and little son, Disma. He never returned from Rajsko. All the Silesians from that group were killed there. Some of them had been in Auschwitz since the first days of the camp and had hoped for survival. Since then, all the Silesians remaining in the camp decisively changed their attitude towards working for the Germans, rejecting it as a no-no. I went to visit my colleague one morning, running quickly through the already empty hallway of Block 5, according to the new numbering, to the roll call. I bumped into Bloody Aloys. He recognized me, even though over a year had passed since our last meeting. He stopped and yelled with some surprise and inconceivable joy in his voice. Was? Du lebst noch? Grabbed my hand and shook it. What was I supposed to do? I did not struggle. He was a strange man indeed. There were several men of this bloodthirsty type in the camp's early days, and some of them were already dead. When faced with external inspection commissions consisting of, among others, some gentlemen in civilian clothing, the camp's authorities tried to show the camp in the best possible light. The inspectors were always shown only the newest blocks, and only those with beds. The kitchen always cooked a good lunch on that day. The orchestra would play beautifully. Only the healthy and strong commandos and those working in the camp's workshops were to enter the camp after the day of labor. The remaining commandos, Zugangs, and those looking miserable had to wait out in the field for the commission to leave the camp. This way, the inspectors were under the impression that the camp was a relatively nice place. The need to show the better side of the camp also forced the authorities to move some of the particularly bloodthirsty torturers from the first months of the camp, especially those who had gained particularly infamy to other camps, among them Krankenmann and Zigrod, Johann Zigruth. The SS men packed them into train wagons and made it clear to the prisoners that they had nothing against the prisoners taking their revenge. The prisoners needed no further incentive. They invaded the wagons and hanged Krankenmann and Zigrod on their own belts. The SS men turned round and did not intrude. This is how the tormentors met their demise. Every witness of so many murders sanctioned by the camp's authorities was a nuisance, even if it were a German capo, and so these two, being witnesses themselves, had to be removed. The organization was constantly growing. Along with colleague 59, Henryk Bartosiewicz, we made it so that Colonel 23, Aleksander Stawar, Lieutenant Colonel 24, Karol Komuniecki, and new men, 90, identity unknown, 91, Stanisław Polkowski, 92, Wacław Weszke, 93, identity unknown, 94, identity unknown, 95, identity unknown, joined our cause. 44, Wincenty Gawron, a great man indeed, was taking care of many inmates, sharing his food with them, as he made his living by painting portraits of the camp's authorities, and was given food for himself for the services he rendered. A transport from Warsaw, March 1942, again brought many friends of mine and news about how things were back home. Major 85, Zygmunt Bohdanowski, came to the camp, and so did 96, Tadeusz Stulginski, the swellest of lads, who had a record for the most severe beatings at Sztucha Avenue in the Pawiak. From them, I learned that Colonel 1, Władysław Surmacki, had been arrested again and imprisoned in Pawiak. It was Colonel 1, Władysław Surmacki, who had directed 96 Tadeusz Stulginski to me. I put 96 Tadeusz Stulginski into the commando of 97 Jan Machnowski, already a member of our organization at the time, commando. We were expanding our organization in two different directions at the same time, recruiting 98 identity unknown and 99 identity unknown in the construction office and 100 identity unknown and 101 Witold Kosztowny in the infirmary. Professor 69, Roman Rybarski, died at the same time. As if on two great pillars, the organization was supported by two institutions, HKB and Arbeitsdienst. When we had to save someone from a transport and keep him inside under roof and cover, or take someone from a commando in which he was not all too popular, or was harassed by some thug, or when we had to have a new fragment of work introduced in some other commando, we would go to Dr. 2, Władysław Dering. Junek, tomorrow's such number will pay you a visit. You need to admit him to the infirmary for some time. Junek, tomorrow's such number will pay you a visit. You need to admit him to the infirmary for some time. Such things could also be arranged with Dr. 102, Rudolf Diem. Once that had taken place, and in a capo's understanding the prisoner was lost, since hardly anyone returned from the infirmary, you could go to 68, Mieczysław Januszewski, and say, make documents for number so-and-so for such-a-such commando, or sometimes this could be done by 103, identity unknown, and the case was closed. This is how we also paved the way for the escape of 25, Stefan Bielecki, and Wincenty Gawron, 44. They were both great men, imprisoned here for possession of firearms. Their cases had been already proven, and they would have surely been shot if they stayed in the camp. The only question was, how long would it take for Grabner's eye in the political department to take notice of their cases? By some miracle, they were still alive. 44, Wincenty Gawron, was painting portraits of SS men, and in his case was postponed, presumably exactly for that reason. But this could not go on forever. In the manner that I have described above, in February 1942, we had 25, Stefan Bielecki, moved to Harmen's commando, to the fish ponds that were several kilometers from the camp, where the prisoners were working with the fish and lived there as well. Much later, in May, 44, Wincenty Gawron went there on the same day as with a message for 25, Stefan Bielecki, from me not to wait, but to flee. I told both of them to make for the hills. They fled from their house through the window, carrying my report to Warsaw.